Welcome to Margin of Thought, where we make space for the questions that matter. I'm your host, Priten, and together we'll explore questions that help us preserve what matters while navigating what's coming. Today I'm joined by Alyssa Muhvic, a high school history teacher in Indiana who brings a rare combination to the table. Alyssa has spent the past several years navigating the shift from traditional classroom instruction to a world where AI is already shaping how students write, research, ask questions, and sometimes avoid the harder work of learning. At the same time, Alyssa has been helping her district think through these issues at a systems level. In this episode, we talk about what it looks like to teach history when students are turning to AI for answers, why equity and privacy remain central concerns, how educators can model responsible use rather than simply prohibit it, and why the work already may be less about mastering every new tool than about teaching students how to think critically in a world saturated with them. Let's dive in with Alyssa's earliest memory of her own use of these tools.
Um, yeah. So I think if I recall correctly, I was a senior when our school first went 1-to-1 in high school. I think that was the first time and they were Chromebooks using Haiku as our platform. And I don't really remember much about Haiku at all. I just know that's what it was named. And so because it was the first year, some teachers used them, some didn't. It was mostly just having a laptop accessibility there. When I went to college, we obviously all had laptops with the learning platform of Blackboard, which then my junior year switched to Canvas. And so like those platforms have been used. I would say Canvas is the most experience I had with a student on a digital platform because Blackboard was fine, but Blackboard was more like hyperlinks to PDFs, whereas Canvas was the first time there was an interactive ed tech tool and platform. And then I feel like everything kind of became modified for Canvas in terms of like ed puzzles or video blocking and the online quizzes and all of those things were all through the Canvas platform.
And as you saw those transitions, both the one-to-one device and the use of a more robust LMS system, do you remember what it felt like as a student? Was it exciting? Was it just kind of like an annoying thing that you kind of had to figure out how to use? Anything you can remember about what that experience was like?
I remember being pissed going from Blackboard to Canvas mid-college career, just in the sense of like, we're gonna be learning a whole new thing and you had to save all your files and like all of that. I remember not being happy about that. However, like I don't ever remember having like necessarily specific feelings towards it. I should say like a special quality of me of like an extenuating circumstance is that I'm dyslexic. So I had academic supports throughout college. So even though a lot of things were digital or online, I very much needed paper copies of everything to be able to hear and see at the same time. And so I felt like I wasn't as dependent or immersed in some of those LMS modules and things like that just because I always had the book that they scanned in and like made a digital audio, and I very much even to this day work on pen and paper in my own learning as a student. So I don't really ever remember having strong feelings towards it either way, just because my style of learning was different.
Um, did having your peers use technology more and you use pen and paper, did that cause any feelings, or you just knew that like that worked best for you and so you didn't really care?
I was gonna say, I think it just worked best for me, so I didn't really care. Like, I spent a lot of my college career in the library or in collaborative learning spaces. And so, like, if I was working in a group, I have fine digital literacy, like, I can do it. It just wasn't my preference. And so I've always thrived in collaborative spaces where there's a lot more like verbal processing and talking things out, and we have somebody taking minutes and notes, and then I can go home and do my own thing. And so I never felt like judged or that it was awkward or that it was moving at a different pace. It was just that my thought process had to go in different steps of orders in order to get to the conclusions that my group was doing in quick digital
Right.
aspects.
Now, moving on to your first few years teaching versus post ChatGPT, I'd love to hear what that transition was like. Like you were early in your teaching career when it came out. So when it did come out, was it shocking? Was it exciting? Were you dreading it? Were you excited to see how you might implement it, especially those first, like that first year, let's think about together.
Yeah. I think when it first came out, I was heavily against it, mostly because of the data and privacy issue, especially working in education where everything is public record and you are having to abide by so many different legal regulations of what information can and can't be. Also, my own personal information, especially being like a young female educator in the field, I was like, I have very strict boundaries between my personal and professional life. And so using AI with the like personal information, I just did not trust it and felt like there wasn't enough testing on it beforehand. Um, and I will say though, it wasn't like I was against ChatGPT using, I just didn't know enough about it and I didn't have enough information in order to figure out what it was. However, I always was under the impression of like, we need to figure this out so that we can be ahead of it. I think it's one of the biggest things if you're just talking about education as a whole. Right? Education is supposed to be navigating the way and leading it and developing global citizenship and future educators and future careers and giving the skills needed. And a lot of that, especially in today's day and age, involves digital literacy and how to use these platforms. And so I would say there was this urgency because a lot of times, even though education is supposed to be the lead, we're kind of the last to adapt to it. Like there's hasn't been a major reform since the 1960s, and that's Brown versus Board of Education. So we're not even talking about curriculum development. It's been over 100 years since we've really looked at how we're trying to lead it. And so I really wanted to figure out how are we going to use this in our classrooms? It's not going to go away regardless how you personally feel about it. And how do we make sure that our kids don't lose the upper hand academically as all these other schools are advancing with it. And so I think there was just this need of, I really wanted immediately professional development. I really immediately wanted studies on it. And I also was talking with a lot of veteran teachers just about the fact of like Google was created, Chrome was created. That was a major change. Now it's in daily use in our teaching. Like it's not something that we get to say yes or no to. It's something that we're going to have to evolve with. So I think that was kind of my initial thought processes of AI.
And has that shifted now? Like about, I guess, 3 years later, do you feel like we're any closer to having a better idea of what data privacy looks like for our students, and what role it plays within the education system? Are we moving along with the times, do you think? Are we catching up at all?
Um, yes and no. I think that when you look at the educational world versus corporate America is doing a lot more with AI than the liberal arts in general careers, which education falls under, is doing.
Right.
I also think that that's easier for the corporate world because corporate world lands in that realm of STEM in which this technology is rooted within. When I think about how educators are using AI, that is different than training students how to use AI in the sense of like an educator's number one tool in creating is probably like something like Canva. And you have AI tools on that to be creating content and worksheets and PowerPoints and interactives, right? But for a majority of our students, they're not going into education. They're going to go into corporate world. I don't know anything about Adobe and AI. So like, are we closer in using AI? I think as an educator on the profession, yes. Are we closer to using AI in a way that prepares kids? I think we're still figuring that out because that world's completely different and how liberal arts and STEM are using AI are completely different.
Yeah, that's a good point about thinking through. It's not just like one big ball of AI that we all need to figure out how to use, but that there's so many different variations and different tools within it. And the ones that are relevant for educators and even like for the learning context. And so maybe like even using a tool that's made for a student to learn like math, foreign language that's AI powered is still very different than preparing them to use the tool that they'll use in their workplace. So tell me a little bit about how you view that trade-off, right? Because there's other stuff that you think is important to teach. Your history major, you obviously teach history, and that's very different than teaching Adobe and AI. So what is your vision of how we solve that problem where we make sure that our students obviously are still learning those important concepts, but also preparing them for those future. So I guess when you think about the content that areas that you teach and that you're an expert in, predominantly history, and you think about the role of teaching students digital literacy, AI literacy in particular for career readiness, how do you balance those two? Because it sounds like, you can find ways to incorporate AI into your workflow. Like, and you talked about using it like for primary sources, and I want to hear more about that in a second. But balancing that with preparing them to use AI themselves for whatever career they choose. Do you see that as something that you need to deal with, or do you think that's a larger problem for the school system?
I think both, right?
Yeah.
It's twofold in the sense of it is my responsibility to be doing that within my classroom. However, I think I'm on the smaller proportion of AI acceptance. And when you're looking at teachers, like the percentage of teachers that are over 20 years is just as much as 5 and under, and they have very
Right.
different perspectives on the world of AI. And so I think it's on the system at large to ensure that educators are equipped and trained and prepared to be doing that in their classroom. I think there's a larger need for uniformed policy expectations and standards around digital literacy as a whole. There's many of states that are changing diplomas or changing laws or changing regulations and changing state standards of like curriculum that we're teaching, but there's not a lot of standards out about digital literacy and specifically the use of AI. And I think like when we're thinking about education system as a whole, I'm not just talking about public education. I'm also talking about colleges and universities. Like they need to make their expectations of incoming freshmen clearer so that we can align our work with what they're doing. There is a wide need of policy development, professional development, and education on it. Then there's also the responsibility of me as just a classroom teacher, right? I only come in contact with 150 kids a year, but those are still my kids that I'm responsible with. The way I see it is I maybe don't know how to use SEM and Project Lead the Way and all of the fancy things that are coming out in my history class, but I can model. I can open the door to have conversations. I can talk about the ethics. I can explain how I utilize it in an equitable and fair way versus just copying and pasting a prompt. I can talk through how I'm creating things. And I think that's where we have a powerful tool is that a lot of times kids almost are scared of using AI because the only way they know how to use ChatGPT is to copy and paste the question into it. And so I think they also need more avenues and exposure points of how it can be incorporated in many different ways and how to use it responsibly. And if we don't have those modeling and thought process questions, we're not going to get the ball rolling.
And what does that look like in terms of how you make time for it in your classroom? Because again, there's so much we expect teachers to be on top of, right? This just feels like another thing that we're expecting teachers to figure out how to navigate with their students. But you're right that it's the need of the time, right? This will make a difference between what career students are able to do, what socioeconomic status they end up in. Their readiness to embrace this technology and use it will be a major differentiator. And so what does that look like in your classroom? I know you talked a little bit about how you use it directly with students,
Mhm.
but yeah, what does this look like for you?
Sometimes it's about just explaining to them what AI tool they're being exposed to and how I came about it. So, for instance, when I was gone for 3 days at a conference, I also had a student teacher at that time. And so I was worried about the fact that my kids need support. I'm not there and I'm really not accessible for 72 hours. So, like, what am I doing to kind of fill in that gap? And so, in that sense, I went to magic school and created my own chat box from the perspective of John Lewis because we were reading his March books in our civil rights unit. And I went through and I uploaded all of my previous notes, presentations that I've made, what my teaching guides look like, what my personal, like, historical record notes are for like when I'm recapping what our assignments were, and I typed up summaries about each of the books and put those in there with a biography about John Lewis. And so then that personalized chat box has access only to my content. And then I put that chat box into our Canvas module. It was like in the 2 hours that I'm gone, or even honestly, if you need help studying and anything, ask this chat box questions and it will generate all of the information coming from me. And then Where I went with that is when I sent out my message to kids. Obviously, I'm still not there, but I explained that entire process. Like, hey guys, I've used Magic School AI. This is how I used it. These are the records that they have access to. So when you're
Yeah.
asking a question, like, this is what it's pulling from, went over expectations and guidelines of how to use it, and then also said, like, explain to them that there's on the teacher backside, it will show me how long you've interacted with it, what specific questions that you've asked it, and what the responses are. So I will go through to make sure that it's still giving verified information on it. And
Yeah.
some students really like that, and some students are like, no, I'm still not touching AI, but at least it's there and it's this thought process. In terms of like making things more engaging on my end, I would consider myself a creative person, but like also creative in history and thinking about like how to always gamify things when you can't necessarily like change the fact that at the end of the day we still have to read the Constitution. It's like twofold of like, yeah, I wanna make it fun, but, like, there are things we just have to do. That's where ChatGPT has been really helpful as a teacher in the sense of uploading our Constitution. My thought partner was like, "I wanna turn this into, like, riddles of a scavenger hunt," and we uploaded it into ChatGPT, put our standards of Indiana into that box to make sure that we weren't taking out the bottom line, what we have to do. Asked it to make 12 different riddles. Kids would have to answer a riddle, find it in the Constitution, highlight and annotate it, and bring that piece of annotation up to me. And then the first team through to get through 12, right? I could easily do that as a teacher if I wanted to, but it would take me a heck of a lot more time. Whereas with ChatGPT, I entered it and it's done. So it's not changing necessarily. Like, I think a lot of times there's this perception that it's making educators lazy, but really what it did was it gave me more time to focus on kids and content than having to actually create the written aspect of the activity. Um, and so I think like also letting them know like this does come from ChatGPT, like this is the use of it. I'm very open with kids about that.
You gave me a lot of follow-up questions, but let's start with that last thing you just said. So you told the students to use ChatGPT. Tell me a little bit about that decision, because that's a question that we get from teachers often. Do we tell the students that we use ChatGPT? And I agree with your gut decision there. I'm kind of curious what your reasoning behind that is, so that other folks can also learn from that.
Yeah, I think from my personal lens, one of my favorite things that switched my whole perspective is I'm not sure, have you ever been exposed to, like, the chart of, like, 100% individual thought of, like, humans to, like, ChatGPT, and, like, there's this study, and it has, like, the scale of 10 steps of, like, where things fall of, like, trying to figure out academic honesty and use of AI versus, like, human thought. So, it was a challenge to me of what happens if you replace AI in that chart with parent help? My
Right.
parent helped me write this essay. My parent revised my essay and gave me feedback. And like that was a big challenge of shifting the perspective and the mindset of like, where do you draw that line? And if we switch AI with a parental or a tutor perspective, would we view it the same? And that's when I really realized like there's a huge equity issue around AI because if you do switch take the robot out of it and put a human into it, then I start thinking about, well, how many students go home and don't have access to a parent after school to ask those questions? How many students don't have the financial resources to be providing a tutor for their student? And so we're using ChatGPT and we're using these ed tech tools as a replacement, sometimes for personal impacts. The world is changing. This is the largest like deficit of inequality in terms of financial accessibility for families that we've seen in a really long time. And so we have to think about how our students are viewing these tools to compensate for different circumstances that they're facing. And that's kind of when I realized like I need to do a better job of articulating how to use it, why to use it, because there are going to be students where this is their only source to ask questions and this is their only platform to seek help. And if we don't teach them how to use it responsibly, they're going to be doing more damage of getting themselves in trouble for plagiarism or illicit use or not knowing how to cite it and source it to make sure that it's reliable information. And one of my core things that I always start every year with it's not my job to teach you what to think, but how to think. And if
Right.
that's what I stand on as a teacher, how to think also has to do with how to utilize digital resources in a responsible manner. And so that's kind of where my thought process was in why I started having conversations and being honest and talking about it. And then as I got more informed and educated on the topic of I realized that also, I mean, we are, like I said, we're in one of the wealthiest counties of, I think, the wealthiest county of the state. And yet we still have quite a high population of free and reduced lunch, for that being said. And thinking about how kids with paid access to ChatGPT is having a much more reliable output by over 20% than our kids that are using just the free platform of ChatGPT. And so now not only are we thinking about accessibility, we're also thinking about reliability in those technologies. And so the same, then it kind of became in my mind, I teach primary sources, secondary sources, source credibility, how we vet for point of view, author, all of those things. Those skills are the exact same skills that has to go into ChatGPT. And if we don't offer them opportunities to find the flaws in the thinking of how those search engines are outputting, then we're not doing a service to our kids, because we still are teaching sourcing, we still are teaching accessibility and research, but we have to view ChatGPT as a search engine that we need to figure out how to navigate and use.
Wow, there was so much there that I think is really useful for even for me to rethink like how we frame this for students, but also for educators in terms of getting them to think similarly about the equity issues in particular that come up. I think oftentimes there's this idea that, oh, like this is going to solve all of our equity concerns. But I think the nuance of like which plan do you have access to? Like, is it a school provided plan with a lot of guardrails and teacher monitoring, or do you have the $200 a month plan that no one else knows how you're using it, right? Like there's a whole range both of power, but also accountability that comes with that entire spectrum of different AI tools that students may or may not have access to. Um,
Mhm,
I'd love to hear about your experience being on your school's committee. You mentioned that you were on the AI task force or
mhm.
AI policy committee. I mean, you've thought a lot about this. I'd love to hear what that looks like. Like how is your perspective being taken into consideration? Who else is on the committee with you? Just want to know a little bit more about the decision making process there.
So our committee has it's district wide. So we have elementary, middle school, and high school teachers on it of multiple different subjects. Some of them are ML leaders, some of them are instructional coaches. Our district level of like assistant superintendent, director of technology, and director of instruction and learning. So we have lots of different voices. And I know that our committee was funded through a grant. I think it's the Eli Lilly one. Don't quote me on that one, but I think that's what it was. And so it was created not by myself. I was asked to be on the committee afterwards, but the goal was to try to get Eric Kurtz to come out. There wasn't enough in the budget for him to come out, but was to get a diverse group of various positions in the district together to pilot some of our AI programs. And so our school decided to go with Magic School. So all of our students and our teachers have access to that. And we were kind of in the lead of testing out what those tools look like, reporting back how we were using it, what we were finding to be useful, which ones we weren't finding useful. We did a book study on AI in which we looked at like engagement practices, implementation, policy, and we all kind of talked through different chapters. And especially when policy terms, we did a lot of looking at what is the role of a district policy versus a building policy versus the academic policy. And that's all still very much in the works. There was year one, and year one was spent a lot of just exposing. Every single person on the committee went to a different conference, whether it was in Ohio, Michigan, or Indiana. We all shared back and reported on it. We created tools for the districts to look at that. But it was really about just exposure, how we're using it, what is our feedback and thoughts about it, and where do we want to go. And so I know that like over summer, I unfortunately couldn't make it to our summer committee meeting, but I know that was where they had sent out like all of what our current policy is, and based on the work in this first year, what changes do we need to make? And so it's kind of this ever ebb and flow, living thing of just talking about it, collaborating about it, and like thinking about how does this fit into our mission as a school, because for us our mission is to be empowered, engaged, and inspire. And when we're thinking about inspiring, we're thinking about how are we innovating the next step and challenging the current norms within education in order to make sure that our students are leaving here with their best possible shot at a future. And so in terms of that innovation and empowering, inspiring in that aspect, we understand as a district that there is a huge need to embrace this. And if we are going to embrace it, we want to be leaders in that field, but we want to be also very careful and apprehensive of what we are putting out.
I'd love to hear more about what your concerns are. I know you mentioned equity concerns and data privacy, but what else is causing some apprehension? Why not just like go full force?
Because I was a student one time, and if I had the ability to copy and paste my homework into a search engine that would give me the responses, and all I have to do is change the format and a couple of words, and then the AI generator's not even gonna catch it. Like, why is there a sense of like concern? Yeah, I'm not stupid. I would have done it too if I was a high schooler, especially with how busy these kids are working jobs, including church, extracurriculars, wanting to be involved as a student, AP classes, the most largest push for dual credit courses. Like there's so many things going on. I totally understand. And I'm gonna be honest, I think the largest issue with academic dishonesty in terms of AI has to do with our AP high level learner kids, not our low level learners. And I think that's a huge misconception in the educational field. I deal with more panic attacks, tears, pressure from our AP level students and our honor students because they are putting so much pressure internally on themselves. They don't want to admit that they're not understanding. They don't want to ever get anything less than an A because an A is tied a lot of times to like their self-worth and their self-esteem. That those are the kiddos that are utilizing this in a dishonest way because they are trying so hard to be perfect. Whereas like the kids who fall kind of in our C average student range, they're going to struggle regardless whether they have AI or not. And so they're not thinking, how do I get this done? Because they're just like, well, if I don't get it, I'm not going to do it. And so we're trying to teach academic stamina and like determination and accountability and time management in that aspect. And so when I think about then our concerns, it's not that just everybody's cheating, it's that this has become now a tool to save time, be able to expand ourselves even more, and it's the easiest way to cheat without getting busted because there's not as many tools that are there, which is where that academic dishonesty and what that looks like comes in. And one of my biggest concerns is like I always tell kids, I'm not actively spending my time trying to find every single instance of illegal use of AI and cheating and back. Like, I don't care that much about it for me to be going with a fine tooth comb. That's not where I want to spend my time and energy. And so, my number one concern is I bust kids using AI almost every week because they're not even reading through it. They are just copying and pasting and submitting it in. And so I will have situations where my concern is not that you used AI, but my concern is that you're submitting work as your own without ever thinking that there's a need to read through it, that you are not having this opportunity to actually learn and engage in the curriculum. You are not learning life skills of advocacy to ask for an extension because you're stressed and you need more time, or you don't know how to ask for help, that you're seeking this alternative thing. There are so many more things that I'm concerned about than the AI use itself. My concern is why we're using it and how are we blindly turning it in, and why do we not think that we have to still check our sources. And I know Google has done a great job of reforming Gemini as their AI search engine to have like those links that are being attached, but I worry if you're using ChatGPT and if especially if you're using it in a private user because you don't want the school to try to track it, which they still can't, but you know, kids think there's a backdoor to everything. It's not giving you those sources and you're not actually reading through it. And so my fear becomes how many kids are getting a grade for work and content that they actually haven't learned? How are we able to measure that learning gap that might be being formed due to that? And how do we ensure that they're not learning like fake history. Like, not to say like it's actively putting out incorrect results, but like I'm pretty sure, unless there's been new studies, last time I checked, regular ChatGPT is only like 68% accurate. So that's, if you think about that, yeah, it's very concerning because I know how many times kids use ChatGPT a day. And if you're thinking only 7 out of 10 questions you're asking it are going to be reliable information, how much of opinion and history and information is being absorbed and internalized that actually is not real at all. And so I'd say those are the concerns that are happening.
I'd love to just end with like when you have conversations with students about this, how receptive are they? I know earlier you had mentioned earlier that like some students were hesitant to use your John Lewis chatbot. I'm curious like what the general sentiment from students is both about the productive uses of AI, but also when you have conversations about academic honesty. Um, how are those conversations going?
Yeah. I would say, like, for context of this question, I have a firm belief that when kids know how to do better, they will do better, right? And so when a kid is making a choice, even with digital literacy or digital fluidity, like an application of it, they're doing the best that they know how. And if we want them to do better, everything has to be used as an opportunity of teaching them. And so, like, when I look at how kids are using it today, honestly, the number one visual that I see them using is their Snapchat AI bot. They will quickly slide that over and ask so many questions about it. When it comes to that, like, I would say that's, if you want to know where kids are willing to put any and all of their information and do not think about it as a second thought, that is the number one embracing of AI that there is on that Snapchat AI friend bot thing. A lot of times when I see that, we have conversations of like, what are you asking it? Well, I didn't understand this question. Okay, well, did you ask me for clarification first? Well, no, you were busy helping someone else. Okay, that's fair. However, like, before you use the internet, you have to use your resources first. Well, why? It gave me the answer. And then I'll say, all right, well, it gave you this answer. Can you define what this word is referencing? Can you define what this event is? Did we cover this content in class? Will it be applicable to a test? And like when asking those questions and having them think through it, that's when then their apprehension kind of starts kicking in of like,
Yeah.
wait a second. Like I've had a kid, I asked, and there was probably 5 kids who used Chat GBT because whatever format I asked the question, for some reason Chat GBT was shooting out an answer about the Rwanda genocide. And so I had about 5 kids turn in this paragraph about the Rwanda genocide. Now, the thing was, this was a question revolving the Iranian hostage crisis and how like the presidents responded and if Reagan or like should really get credit for it. Nothing to do with the Rwanda genocide. Okay. And so, like, it's in situations like that where kids kind of have this mortifying moment of, like, oh, maybe this isn't as reliable. But it's not until they have an experience where they're being called out about it that they're like, wait, what? And I always start those conversations with, like, hey, Jimmy, tell me about the Rwanda genocide. And usually they stare at me and they're like, I don't know. I think we learned about that in 7th grade. I'm like, oh, so you don't really know much about that? Really? Because your whole assignment, you wrote about the Rwanda genocide. And then we can have conversations about like, yes, this is academic dishonesty. There are going to be consequences for you turning this in. But now there's also different conversations about like, oh, so I can't use ChatGPT like that. And I just think that if we were more proactive with AI and like did assignments where you are asked, like, right, like when I was teaching that, I took that as a moment of like, I don't know why that question triggers the Rwanda genocide in the search engine, but I could take that at the beginning of the year school, asking everybody to open up ChatGPT, put that question in, and raise your hand if you got actually information about the Iranian hostage crisis versus how many of you got the Rwanda genocide. And then talk about that. Like, have those things because I think kids are willing to embrace it at any level until they get in trouble or caught or their bubble about it is broken. And unless we start giving them situations to burst their AI bubble, I don't think they really have concerns or apprehensions about it.
Wow, I love the idea of bursting the AI bubble. That seems to be what all of our mission ought to be. Um, how do you keep up with all of this, right? So, like, I think like one of the concerns that we get from teachers is they share some of your big picture concerns. They share concerns about equity. They share concerns about like how do we get students to understand both the fallibility of the AI tools, but also what academic dishonesty looks like. But they also want to make sure their students are prepared for the future and whatever careers that they want to pursue. But there's so much information. It's constantly changing. And I can barely like keep up with what the 3 years ago looked like, let alone like what next year is going to look like. Do you find that you have external support systems, or is there something that you're doing on your own? Like, where is that coming from? Because it's fascinating to me just to hear how much you've thought about it and also how much you've worked on it.
Okay. So I don't have very many external supports, but that's because, as I said, our district is very much in that early beginning stage. I think the fact that we even have AI policy is actually means that we're beyond the beginning stages. But this is kind of, and I put this kind of together for me. It started off just as like when I went to OTech, there's so much information out there at one time. But then as I have had experiences with it, I've created this in the sense of I needed something to do it. And so this way, when I know I kind of work backwards in my use of AI of I create my content the way I would create it and continue to create it that way. But then as I am creating my content or changing it or adapting it, I'll be like, okay, this needs more visuals. Then I can just come here and click on my visual. Like I use Napkin all the time. I don't know if you've ever used it, but it's my favorite AI tool. Not even gonna lie. I think that's where networking comes in a lot of like every time I see a presenter, I follow them on Twitter just to ensure that there are things that are going on, articles and things like this. So this is kind of how I keep things done in the sense that you can't. The answer's no. You can't keep up with everything. You can't be an expert in everything. You cannot have enough time in the day to do your job and also do it. I was looking at a professional development catalog over it. I was looking at somebody else's hub to see how they were working theirs to see if there's anything that I'm missing. Like I have tabs all over the place about AI use. And so when it comes to that, like there are so many things that I open and keep open on my laptop of like, I want to come back to this and I just never do. And so I think at some point, educators have to give themselves grace in understanding that you're not meant to be an expert in everything. It's like I'm never going to read every single World War II book that is out there, but I know which ones I'm going to lean on when I teach it. And I think that's what educators need. They need to know which tools work for them and how to lean on them in a way that protects student privacy, but also enhances our educational outcomes and learning goals. I think teachers really need exposure to just a plethora of them so that they can be like, wait, this one works really well for me. Because what works well for another teacher is not going to work well for me, which is not going to work well for somebody that I'm mentoring. I think schools just need to do a better job of creating points of exposure and points of exploration. Like, for instance, there was somebody who had an ed tech March Madness template in like one of the communities that I'm a part of. I took that, made it our own for our school district, utilizing the specific partnerships that we have within the district. And we did it in the month of March as a March Madness, a 3-week challenge. Every single week, there was a different winner that either got a free AI tool membership of their choice or an administrative coverage for a second prep for the week, right? Because when we're thinking about how to best prepare educators for the sheer amount of information and tools that is about to be thrown at them. Like, if you think about how many have already been thrown in the last 3 years, like, I can't even imagine what it looks like in the next 3. And so when we're thinking about that, we are about to ask educators to become they're always active learners, but we are asking them to become a different level of active learner that a lot of them haven't had to be for a long time. Also, if you're looking specifically at Indiana, you're asking them to take on more as an active learner as they are also trying to revamp our core diploma And so we're asking them at a higher level to go back to school for masters, to be able to teach within the pipeline of dual credit and core credit. We're also changing our summer school targeting because now you have to pass iLearn as a third grader. There are so many things that are actively changing in education as a whole that to add in this digital literacy active learner piece is a crazy unforeseen feat, I would say. And so I would say it's really on districts and administrators to do two things for educators at this time in order for them to be active learners, and that's to protect their time and to protect their income in the sense of really people only care about money and time. And if schools cannot give more money, like it's publicly regulated, it's a limited source of income. And so we really have to protect educators' time. And if we can provide them more time in the day to be active learners, so that's not having to take time outside in their personal lives, I think that's when you're going to have a magic moment in education where we can all have protected spaces to learn so that we can then implement in it. And I think that that's a long time in the making, but I definitely think it's possible.
I really, really
Yes.
appreciate your time today.
Of course, ditto. Good luck with everything. Don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything else.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you to Alyssa. Alyssa does not treat AI as a separate issue. Rather, she treats it as something that is already reshaping the conditions of learning, often in ways schools have not fully caught up to. And what she makes clear is that the real challenge is when their students are learning how to use these tools with discipline, honesty, and critical judgment. Keep listening as we continue exploring the ethics and realities of education technology, and for more on how educators can lead during this transition, check out my book, Ethical EdTech, at ethicaledtech.org. Thanks for listening to Margin of Thought. If this episode gave you something to think about, subscribe, rate, and review us. Also, share it with someone who might be asking similar questions. You can find the show notes, transcripts, and my newsletter at preten.org. Until next time, keep making space for the questions that matter.